So hello everyone, my name is Michelle Conway and I'm going to be chairing the webinar this evening. The other members of my team who are present is Professor Eilish Hennessy and Han Nguyen, which we're all on the screen at the moment, and we are all part of the Youth Mental Health Lab in UCD. We'd like to thank you all for your interest in tonight's webinar. We are absolutely delighted to welcome Dr. Paul Dalton, who has agreed to speak on this really important topic this evening. Before I introduce him, I'd just like to tell you a little bit about the structure for tonight's webinar. We're going to start by telling you about a research project we are conducting on adolescent help seeking for mental health problems that we're undertaking at the moment. Then Paul will speak for about 40 to 45 minutes. And when he's finished, we're hoping to have a couple of minutes at the end for questions. So if you would like to ask any questions, we do hope that you'll write them in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. It is unlikely that we will get around to all of the questions, but we will do our best to answer as many as possible. Just to let you know, the webinar tonight is being recorded and we will post a video of the website on the UCD Mental Health Lab website. And we'll post a link to the lab in the comments section throughout the webinar so you can take a copy of it. So first off, I might tell you a little bit about a research project that we're doing. For this, Paul, I might ask you to pop on your second slide, if that's all right.
Mm-hmm. It might be my third. There we go.
Perfect. So for our research project, we're aiming to better understand the factors that influence a young person's decision to seek help for a mental health problem. There's a great need for this research because, as we know, young people are among the age group that are the least likely to seek help, and yet they're also the age group that are most likely to develop a mental health problem. As part of this research, we want young people to take part in a short survey for us, and we'd be so grateful if you would give permission for your child to take part. You can find out more about this research via the QR code on the screen, or we'll also put up a link in the comments section, which will bring you to a parental information page. After reading this page, you can decide whether or not you would be willing to forward the link or the QR code at the bottom of this information page to your child. We will then remind you again about this research towards the end of the talk. So without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce our speaker, Dr. Paul Dalton. Dr. Dalton is an associate professor in the UCD School of Psychology. He's a clinical psychologist, researcher, teacher, writer, and speaker, regularly appearing on national media, talking on a range of topics relating to mental health. He's actively involved in national policy development and public debates. In this talk, he'll provide some practical tips for parents who are coping with worried and anxious teenagers. So without further ado, Paul, I will hand the reins over to you.
Terrific. Thank you very much. And thank you for the kind invitation to speak. I'm delighted to. But full disclosure, as I begin, I'm not a parent. I do, however, know a fair bit, or at least a little bit, about anxiety, about emotions, and how emotions get in the way of sleep and living a relatively meaningful life. I worked for 18 years in cancer care in St. Vincent's, and saw a lot of anxiety, a lot of worry, naturally in that setting, but also know that from a personal level as well. So that's what I'm going to speak from tonight. In thinking about tonight, I was reminded of a patient that I saw many years ago who had a diagnosis, a cancer diagnosis, and I distinctly remember him saying to me, he said, I'm not so worried about what's going to happen. I'm not so worried about the treatment or not a cure. And I said, well, what are you worried about, or what's your concern? And he said, I had a great life, but I just wasn't there for it. I had a great life, but I just wasn't there for it. A man, a parent of 3 or 4 children, So when thinking and talking about the title of tonight's talk, Tired but Wired, I think it's wrapped up in that idea or that sense or experience that many of us have of living a relatively good life, but often finding ourselves not being present, not being there, life slipping by, and maybe at at a little more intense level, the tired but wired, not my term, but one that I came across, and it really struck with me. And I think most of us will have the experience of getting towards the middle of the week or the end of the week, or maybe to Monday, and getting into bed exhausted, really tired, but wired. These minds of ours, having a life of their own, and really that tired but wired phenomenon in so many ways, I think, is just connected to our, maybe almost our addiction, our compulsion to run and to keep going. But of course, that's not just our fault. We're under enormous pressure externally. And I think this is particularly true for the sandwiched generation of people who maybe are listening tonight, people who are caring for children and caring for parents. And I've said this before, we are among the first generation where if there are two partners in a family, where both are having to work and sometimes work full time, as well as all of the care on both sides of the sandwich. And I've said this before, and sometimes get into trouble for it. But I think it's really important to point out that the concept, the theory of U-shaped happiness. So happiness researchers have looked at happiness across many parts of the world and identified what they termed U-shaped happiness. So when we begin in life, our happiness is, well, all going well, is high, and it drops to the bottom of the U. And it drops to the bottom of the U between kind of 30 and 40 years of age. It seems that decade is the decade of least happiness. I hope that's not too off-putting for anyone tonight. The good news is, of course, that all going well, happiness increases. But as I say, there are many demands that are outside of our control. The demands are immense. I always think it's helpful. There's nothing as more practical than good theory, and people will be perhaps familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So it's a fairly well regarded and respected theory of human needs, and of course, at the very bottom of that are our physiological needs. So food, warmth, water, and rest. And then as we go up the pyramid to those needs for safety and security, intimacy, intimate relationships and belonging and esteem and self-actualization. For many and for many parents, the challenge and the task is providing a sense of safety and the physiological needs for their children, and that task is immense and not to be taken lightly. So there are these external factors at play that place a huge demand on our capacity and our resources. One of my bugbears is we can sometimes over psychologize difficulties, and end up blaming the individual. So personalizing psychological distress, emotional difficulties, when sometimes, in fact, they are the result of systems and structures that we live in. So it may not be my individual personal fault that at times I find life really, really difficult, or that I get very stressed. So that, to me, that's an important caveat. Sorry, this is the revised Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I used to say it applied to adolescents, but actually it applies to adults. So essential to our well-being, our battery life, and Wi-Fi. Stress. So I want to talk a little bit about stress tonight, and a little bit about contentment. But just to start off, to say that stress has gotten a really, really bad reputation. Stress is essential for human survival. The idea that we could live with in a stress-free state is quite simply delusional. Stress is necessary for human survival. What's detrimental, if that's not too strong a word, to human survival, and what's detrimental to human well-being, to joy and ease, and to contentment, is chronic stress. And chronic stress really is the stress that doesn't stop. It continues. It doesn't get switched off. It stays on. And it's that chronic stress that's largely responsible for the tired but wired. So in short, it's really, really appropriate that we have episodes of stress. Nothing wrong with that. The difficulty is when that gets switched on. When we find ourselves living in a heightened stress of stress when it's actually not necessary. I'd like to talk a little bit tonight as well about a thing called contentment. So to flip our dialogue a little bit, and to focus, maybe not so much focusing on stress and anxiety, but rather on contentment. And contentment is a topic or a construct that's receiving quite a bit of attention in psychological research in various parts of the world. So I want to talk a little bit about contentment, and to talk towards the end about contentment boosting techniques. So what are the ways that we can boost our level of contentment? How do we cultivate or increase our quota of contentment? And what I want to do is to describe the link between contentment and attention. So contentment, that feeling, and how it's connected to attention, to what we pay attention to. When I say attention, I'm talking about where our mind goes, consciously, unconsciously. What we're paying attention to influences the degree of contentment I feel. So at least that's what some of the researchers and theorists are saying. And maybe test it out for yourself a little bit more. Contentment is the opposite of being in flight or fight or freeze. So when we are in a high state of stress, we are prepared physiologically to fight, to take flight, to run away, or to freeze in the hope that we won't be seen. So the whole nervous system is involved in a high state of stress, and that's not sustainable. And I'm hoping tonight that we might it might make a little bit of sense to you, actually, that contentment might be the antidote to high states of stress, to fight, flight, or freeze. As we make our way and talk through this, I say this, and because back to my own caveat. So the high alert piece, but sorry, just to say, yeah. Those the physiological effects of being in high alert or stress, we all know them. Our the heart beats faster. Our digestive system is not as it should be. Our muscles are tense. You might even notice now how the muscles are in your shoulders, or the muscles in your jaw. You can be over clenched. You might even notice the rate of breathing, how shallow or how deep. And certainly with prolonged periods of stress, it results in all sorts of difficulties with bowel and digestive systems. But for now, what I want to say, I hope there are no serious employees of Ryanair there, but thinking about parenting, about caring for people that we love, and this idea that actually, when the air steward is making the announcement to firstly put on your own mask before taking care of the vulnerable people around you. So when the plane hits turbulence or is coming down, the advice being to attend to your own mask. And tonight I'd really offer that as a guide, that attending to ourselves first, because we simply cannot drink from an empty cup. If there's nothing there, we've nothing to give. So that's a really important piece to say. That is, of course, if you can afford the mask. There are lots of definitions or attempts to define what contentment is. And I've kind of struggled about finding one that I think maybe captures contentment in the best way, and feel that probably this is the one that does. That the relentless pursuit of happiness often overshadows the more subtle yet profound emotional state of contentment. Contentment or happiness seen as a fleeting high, with which, friends, there's absolutely nothing wrong with happiness, by the way, or satisfaction. These are good things, but there is something about the hum of satisfaction that resonates more deeply. The contentment is a state probably more, certainly more visceral. So it has a very strong physiological component, and one could argue, much more lasting. So often said that contentment is the knowledge of enough, that what is here right now is enough. And that happens, as I said, in the body and in the mind, heart. That it's a physical, visceral experience when we experience contentment. And as I said, it's more than happiness. Happiness is that tends to be the passing pleasure, like the pleasure we get from a new car, or a lovely meal, or the company of people that we love, or a sunset, or a swim, and that's all absolutely beautiful. Nothing wrong with that at all. But the challenge is that those experiences tend to be transitory. And it's argued that cultivating contentment tends to be less transitory. So it tends to be a little more available. Um, and the early research is drawing quite a link between contentment and resilience. Um, Resilience being our capacity to get back up. Resilience is not about preventing us from falling down. If we're going to live a life worth living, if we're going to care about things in the world, if we're going to care about other people, we're going to fall down from time to time. And resilience is about the bounceability. It's about our capacity to bounce back, to come back. And there's some interesting research linking contentment and resilience. So I was saying, just as we were a few moments ago, that there is a big link, it would seem, between contentment and attention. And attention, so our capacity to pay attention to what I'm saying, to the screen, to driving, to listening to your kids, to watching the television. Our capacity to pay attention, as I said, is very connected to our degree of contentment. Our attention has been described as the new gold. So if there's a gold rush or a new gold rush, that gold rush is for our attention. And we are bombarded with all sorts of very ingenious attempts to grab our attention. The most sophisticated technology is being used to grab our attention, and to get us to consume. I think it's fair enough to say that when the attention grabbing that we're exposed to is generally about getting us to consume. When we are discontented, we consume. We consume food, booze, social media, clothes, gadgets. We are being fed very often a narrative of not enough. That where I am, who I am, what's happening right now is not enough. And I think for a lot of us, we will know the feeling of disquiet or discontentment that scrolling can do for us. My guilty pleasure is Pinterest, and Pinterest can bring me a lot of joy for maybe minutes, but very soon it begins to deplete. So it's drawing my attention, and very often the underlying message is that I'm not enough. So promoting a sense of discontentment. Contentment is revered in many cultures throughout the world as one of the highest human states. There's a researcher, Carvado, and he's looked at this across many continents and many parts of the world, and seems to have located in many peoples around the world a regard for the state of contentment that often seen as the most highly enlightened, highly aspired to state for a human being. And I think, and I've thought this before, that, remembering or recalling people in our lives that we like to be around, perhaps older people in our lives who are with us or who are deceased, very often those that we choose and like and enjoy being around are those with a sense of ease and contentment. We're rarely drawn to the discontented, the disquieted. We're often more drawn to people who have a degree of contentment and ease. It's also really important then just to connect a little bit. So when I talk about attention and what we pay attention to and the connection with contentment, I think it's this well-known, apparently, golf player, who says that, well, the more I practice, the luckier I get. Now, there's some very important psychological research behind that, and summarized by that idea that what I practice, what I repeat, I get better at. So if I am repeating, giving my attention to having a very split attention, if I am repeating certain internal narratives or conversations about myself, or certain ways of looking at the world, that's what I get better at. So, and the opposite is true too, that if I repeat practices where I acknowledge and know and move up close to a sense of contentment, I get better at that too. One of the, to my mind at least, really important contributions, clinically, most definitely, from Western psychology over the last number of years has been this idea of the negativity bias. So in short, this concept that we have a bias, a neurological brain bias towards negative events and information. It's sometimes said, I think Ross Harris has said, that our brains are like Velcro for the bad and Teflon for the good. So we, as a species, have a very well developed capacity in our brains to hold on to Velcro to negative experiences. And it would seem we have a lot of us have a very poorly developed capacity in the brain to hold on to the good experiences, the moments of ease and joy and success and well-being. Now, there's a really considered and well-researched body of research behind all of this, and the function of the brain, and the brain's function towards negativity is connected to our survival. So sometimes said that when our ancestors lived on the savannah, and suddenly there was the sight of a very large threatening animal, they needed to move very fast and very quickly. So fight, flight, or freeze, run away, and the body preparing to do all of that. But then when some of that was safe, all that began to settle. So we now live in bodies that have evolved over many millions of years, and indeed a human brain, depending on what you read, the human brain that we now, the hardware and software that we carry around with us, evolving over, some would say, close to 4 million years. So when it comes to tired and wired, when it comes to stress and anxiety and these racing minds of ours, it's really, really, really important to say that it's not our fault. We've inherited tricky hardware and tricky software in these brains that have been evolving for many, many years. One aspect or one part of that is the negativity bias, that we are on the lookout for what's wrong, what could go wrong, how will I be found out, what's going to happen next, the yes but then, and jumping ahead of myself a little bit, these are not, this capacity of the human mind to jump to the future, to focus on the negative, is not new. In ancient Buddhist philosophy or psychology, 2,500 years ago, there's a word that I love in Pali, and the word is papancha. I think it's a lovely word. And papancha basically is what we call rumination. The mind doing, it goes from one thing to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next. So 2,500 years ago, the Buddha was saying, actually, that's called papancha. And it'll drive you crazy. One way to manage and to cultivate a different way of being is to get to know our attention and where our attention goes. Because very often, our attention is unconscious. It's gone before we even know it. So a lot of the trials behind mindfulness-based interventions, almost, one of the first big randomized control trials, at its heart was the idea of preventing relapse from depression by increasing awareness. So the cognitive, the papancha, that goes on when then we find ourselves, at the bottom, the downward spiral, depressed, and or the upward spiral, and hugely anxious and having full-blown panic. To do wonderful research, a complete injustice, the mindfulness research said, well, actually, if we can increase the level of awareness, then we don't find ourselves spiraling out of control, or we don't find ourselves necessarily spiraling down into full depressive state. And that is connected, and where the negativity bias is alive and well, or the Velcro for the bad and the Teflon for the good. So, as I said, there is an evolved human brain that is our inheritance. It's not our fault. We didn't design this. These brains are full of glitches, and our job as trying to be decent human beings is to try and manage these brains. And this is how I understand it, because I have a very basic understanding of it. But we have a very ancient brain, the kind of reptilian brain, right here at the top of the spine, right buried right in the head here, the old brain. And that's where emotions and behavior and relationship syncing and flight, fright, or freeze happens in this ancient part of the brain. And then in the more recent developed part of the brain, over thousands and thousands of years, is the front of the brain, the frontal cortex in particular, where our imagination and planning and our capacity to write poetry, our capacity to invent drugs and to paint and to do beautiful things in the world happens. So old and new brain, often described, or at least this is how I think about it. And when I teach the undergrads in UCD, I often say, the old brain is the weekend brain. It's the brain that wants to sleep and drink and have sex and do all those kind of fun things. The new brain is the kind of Monday to Friday, if you're lucky. But what happens for us is we're living with an old and a new brain, and there's a conflict. And that conflict, as I said, is not of our making. There's a researcher and writer in the field, if you're interested in this area, a guy called Paul Gilbert and a team in the UK, wrote a very beautiful book. One of those books I think I wish I could write, or called The Compassionate Mind. And Paul really sets out the science behind a lot of what I've just tried to explain over the last 20 minutes in a very accessible way. So if it's something you're interested in, please do check him out. And again, to summarize his research, so he talks about the wandering mind as an unhappy mind. So through lots of really innovative research, they, thousands of people monitor their wandering mind during the day at a prompt. So they'd kind of go, oh, my mind is 7 out of 10 wandering, and my happiness or contentment level is 2 or 3. So there was a relationship, a correlation between the amount of mind wandering and the degree of unhappiness. So if you want to live an unhappy life, it seems the best thing you can do is let your mind do its own thing. If you want to live a slightly happier life, it's really helpful to build practices in to help manage and settle the mind. And this relates back to what I was saying at the opening about the gentleman, the children, about saying, he said to me, I'm not worried about the future. I'm not worried about the treatment not working or perhaps, my life coming to an end. He said, I had a great life, but I just wasn't there for it. So that's what this is about. The wandering mind interrupts and gets in the way of the life that we have and our capacity to be there for it. Just keep an eye on the time, it's 7:45. We can be brave and afraid at exactly the same time, all day, every day. So often there is an assumption that bravery and fear are opposites, or we need to experience them as opposite things. And that is simply not the case. Our emotional lives don't respect categories. So when I slow down, I might actually notice that I can feel afraid and I can feel brave. They're not, our emotional life is much more fluid and much more fluid than we might like to think that it is. So when we begin to experience a degree of contentment, with that may come some fluctuation of disquiet or dis-ease. Probably one of the lessons that I've learned as a clinician, working directly with patients and as a human being, is if we have strong, troubling emotions as adults, if we have strong, troubling emotions, the most unhelpful thing we can do is to push them away constantly. One of the most helpful things that we can do is to learn to lean in to what's already here. So what we avoid becomes bigger and bigger and bigger. What we lean into, what we name, we can tame. And it's probably one of the most fundamental things that maybe I'm a little bit slow, but one of the most fundamental psychological insights that I've kind of come across, hard won, and not that it's something that's there for me constantly. I think she's a Taylor, Jill Taylor, a physiologist of sorts. She's a very interesting piece on YouTube, and basically her hypothesis, or well, I should say her experience, is that an emotion, when we don't push it away, or we don't criticize it, or we don't get into the blame game, an emotion lasts about 90 seconds. If you want to make an emotion last forever or for an hour, start adding to it commentary, judgment, should, shouldn't, evaluation. And that fuels the emotion. So if we don't go after an emotion with all sorts of commentary, sometimes that's unconscious. It should have about a 90-second shelf life. And she's a very nice piece on YouTube where she describes that happening. I'm going to have to move quickly now. I'm sorry. Who can argue with Einstein? But we're not going to solve our emotional, we're not going to solve any problem. We're not going to solve global problems. We're certainly not going to solve emotional problems with the same kind of thinking that created them. So if anxiety, stress, tired and worried is a feature of your life, it's going to call for some different kind of thinking. And my contention is by developing contentment. This is not, by the way, anything to do with positive thinking or that other dreadful thing about manifesting. Positive thinking, this idea that if I think positively about it, it'll have a good outcome. That's for children and needs to end when you're about 7 years of age. This is nothing to do with positive thinking. That's a whole topic for another night. A very wise woman called Pema Chodron, written a lot on this, talks about learning to stay with our uneasiness, to stay with the tightening, so that the habitual chain reaction doesn't continue to rule your life. The only way to ease our pain is to experience it more fully. That's a big thing to say, isn't it? I often talk and like to talk a little bit about contentment or self-compassion, and very often we can get confused between self-compassion, contentment, ease, and self-indulgence. Contentment and certainly practices of self-compassion often mean saying no and taking a harder line to ourselves, a harder line with ourselves. I want to conclude with I'm going to leave that there, but I want to conclude with just a couple of thoughts about cultivating contentment. So if you're kind of half interested in anything I've said, or if it kind of sparks any sort of question, and you're interested in this idea of cultivating contentment, it starts with paying attention, the new gold. So learning to pay attention to what's happening right now, to this breath, this body, this moment. So even right now, even paying attention to the contact with the chair you're sitting on. So learning to pay attention. And I've talked before about developing a skill or cultivating a skill to double click on the beautiful and on the lovely. So this is again related to the Teflon, the Velcro and Teflon brain, to the negativity bias. So when something beautiful, when something sweet, when something kind, when something soulful happens in your life, to double click on it, and that way it can begin to have the opposite effect um, on the negativity bias. Um, just to say two other things that there's a great fiction that some people like me um, are, are fond of doling out, and that's the fiction of fixing yourself, fixing ourselves. That one day we'll be emotionally, psychologically all sorted. That's an illusion, and it's never going to happen. Paul Gilbert, who I mentioned, talks about um, setting an intention to live your life as a compassionate mess. So giving up the fiction of getting it all together. The the writer, she wrote Out of Africa and Babette's Feast. Karen Blixen, I think, is her name, and she said, she said, I know of a cure for everything, and that is salt water. Salt water is a cure for everything. Sweat or tears or the salt water of the sea. Sweat or tears or the salt of seawater may not cure everything, but can certainly initiate some degree of healing. So I'm going to have to stop now because I've gone over my time. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much, Paul.
Sorry, I'm just going to say, because I wanted to remind people, I just wanted to remind people about the research that my colleagues are doing in UCD. If you wouldn't mind giving that a little bit of thought, and we also have on the slide some really helpful support services for parents. And yeah, okay, I'll stop now.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Paul, for that amazing talk. I hope that everyone attending tonight has picked up something interesting to them and how it will help them and their teenagers in the future, be wiring their mind. Just picking up from what you just said there, I just wanted to remind all the parents before we go to the Q&A section that we are gathering data about the factors that influence a young person's decision to seek help for a mental health problem. We would be so grateful if they would give permission to your child to take part. In order to do this, you can scan the QR code, which will bring you to more information on our study. And at the bottom of that page, you can, if you want your child to participate, you can send them on the QR code or the link at the bottom of the parental information page. You can either start by scanning or there's a link that is in the comment box. So I'll leave that up and then we might start with, there's a good few questions that came in that we might be able to answer one of two of them before we go, Paul. So most commonly, a lot of parents are looking for some recommendations for children with disrupted sleep schedules. A lot of teenagers and children aren't a fan of waking up early for school and have probably disrupted phone use patterns, staying up late. Are there any recommendations without resorting to highly drastic measures to get a better sleep schedule or help the mind calm down a little bit before bed?
So it's, I mean, not my area when it comes to children and adolescents, but I'm very, very happy to find resources, appropriate resources, and to send them on through you, if that's okay, Michelle.
Yeah.
Might be the best thing. Yeah, I don't want to recommend anything offhand because it's not my area. I don't know a huge amount about adolescence and sleep and generally. So.
Then another question has come in for people dealing with ADHD, and obviously deal with a very active and wandering mind by nature, and it's some were saying it's not as simple as deciding to practice paying attention from the nature of having a very active mind. Is there anything you could comment
Yeah,
on that?
yeah, yeah. No, look, it's a really good point. So I think what we can do, contentment is fit. We experience it in the body. So if the nature of our minds is to be very, to be very busy and very distracted, really honing in on activities that result in a physical calmness can be really, really important. So in actual fact, kind of starting with the body is often much more helpful than trying to start with the mind. Um, and some of those things, very basic things like caffeine intake. That if our caffeine intake is high, for example, you got to reduce it by half at least. So the thing about contentment is it's visceral and how bodyful it is. So placing the focus on the body maybe rather than on the busy mind, and seeing what impact that might have.